Children away, children away. Let's roam them all this breath.
For the three girls, Maud! Can't bring them out to the blackfellas camp.
No, that's my kid, mine!
It's the law, Maud.
No!
I've got no say in it.
No, mine!
Mr. Neville, listen, move 1 inch and I'll lock your mother up.
From 1906 to 1969 in Western Australia, it was the law to take away the Aboriginal children from their families. This era was called the Stone Generations. During this time period, lots of Aboriginal people, including the children, were exploring their rights. They were also exchanging and accounting with the Europeans. The children taken away were the offsprings of the Aboriginal Indigenous people, the first people in Australia. 60,000 years ago, when Australia and Papua New Guinea were connected by a land bridge to make the continent of Sahul, the indigenous people arrived in Australia by using the land bridge as a passageway from Papua New Guinea. Once in Australia, they learned that they had to live there because their only way back was covered by water. For hundreds of years, they lived in Australia. The people made tribes. These tribes lived in harmony towards each other. The people were very peaceful and family-focused. They lived in huts made out of logs, leaves, sand, and things they found. The peace and harmony among the tribes stopped when the Europeans arrived in Australia during the late 1700s.
Yes, the colony started to impose on people's hunting grounds, impact on Aboriginal people, diseases. It absolutely decimated the smallpox particularly.
In 1788, the same year the settlers arrived, the Aboriginal population was 1,250,000 people. In 60 years, it was 125,000 people. The decline in the Aboriginal population started the Aborigine Protection Acts. These laws were supposed to protect the Aboriginal people, but there was a hidden plan behind them. The Europeans wanted to get rid of Aboriginal culture. They thought they could do this by either killing all the Aboriginal people or making them exchange Aboriginal culture for European culture. The Aborigines Act that probably affected the Aboriginal people in Western Australia the most was the Aborigines Act 1905. This law took away lots of rights from the Aboriginal people, including the rights to their children. The law said that in Western Australia, all Aboriginal children under the age of 18 were in the custody of the state. The Aborigines Act 1905 was the start of the Stolen Generation in Western Australia. The Stolen Generations was also called the child removal. Someone from the state would come and take the Aboriginal children away from their families. Sometimes after an Aboriginal woman had given birth at a hospital, the nurse would take away the child. Then they would tell the birth parents that the child had died. The children taken away were put into institutions or missions. The Aborigines Act 1905 called for the institutions to be like boarding homes. They had to have clean living conditions and provide the children with education and food. In most cases, this wasn't true. The only education, if any, that was taught was that the Aboriginal race was bad. As for the living conditions, the children were all crammed into a tiny room. Most had to sleep on the floors. They would only get new clothes once a year and they were given minimal food.
They would not pay any money to repair the houses. There was no plumbing.
Along with the horrible living conditions, the children would encounter physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. If a child spoke the Aboriginal language or acted Aboriginal in any way, or if they misbehaved, they would be paddled, smacked, slapped, or beaten. The children were mostly trained on how to be domestic servants. The girls would be taught how to clean or cook, and the boys would be taught how to do labor-intensive work. Children were also put into newspaper ads. These ads would look for foster homes for them. The foster homes weren't much better than the institutions. The children were rarely adopted for love. Most were just adopted to become servants for the people. The whole time, the children were exploring their rights. The children were taken away because the government thought they were being neglected or so that they could have better living conditions. Some people at the institutions cared about the children. They wanted them to have a better life. These were the places where the children got some love and care. The original concept of the Aborigines Act 1905 was to help the Aboriginal people, but the law was misinterpreted by ignorant people. Even though there were people who helped the children out at the institutions, they were really rare. Some homes were nicely made and had good living conditions. In some places, the children were not abused. They were cared for and loved. In scarce cases, when a child was adopted by a European couple, he or she were cherished by the foster parents and they were also treated like family. Western Australia wasn't the only state to have the Aborigines Act. By the 1930s, all Australian estates had this law. Around this time, the country said that all Australian people should be one culture. In the government's point of view, by taking the Aboriginal children away from their families, they were doing everyone a favor. By the 1950s, the Aboriginal people were leading civil rights movements. They were rioting because they wanted their rights back. They wanted their children back from the institutions. By watching the protesters, the Australian government realized that these people were encountering racism. The rioting caused the Aborigines Act 1905 to be repealed by the Native Welfare Act in 1963. Under this law, the children were no longer in the custody of the state. After the Aborigines Act was repealed in Western Australia, the remaining states followed in its footsteps. Even though this happened in 1969, the institutions were still open until the late 1970s. Around this time period, families started to look for their lost loved ones. Sometimes they were found, sometimes they weren't. To this day, some Aboriginal people are still looking for their families. After the Stolen Generations, Aboriginal people started exploring the outside world. While they were there, they started encountering problems. They were discriminated against and they were called ugly names. Some people turned to suicide to stop their suffering. Most of the Stolen Generations fell into depression or other mental health issues. People were saying that, like the Jewish camps in World War II, the Stolen Generations never happened. In 1997, the Australian state released the Bringing Them Home report. This was an inquiry of the Stolen Generations. It said that the Stolen Generations was indeed a genocide and that the Indigenous people had endured violations to their human rights. The report also promised that there would be no other laws like the Aborigines Protection Acts ever again. This was due to the fact that 10 to 33% of the children were taken away from their families during this time period. 1 year after the Bringing Them Home report was published, the first National Sorry Day was observed. This was on May 26, 1998. National Sorry Day commemorated the Aboriginal people who were affected by the Aborigines Protection Acts. People all throughout Australia started observing this day every year. Even with the Bringing Them Home report and the National Sorry Day, the Aboriginal people were still looking for a public apology from the government. Finally, 45 years after the Native Welfare Act was passed in Western Australia, Australia's Prime Minister Kevin Rudd apologized to the Aboriginal people on the behalf of the state.
We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these our fellow Australians. We apologise especially for the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, their communities and their country. For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind, we say sorry.
This speech marked a new era in Australia's history. It brought hope and joy to the people. The speech also helped motivate the two races to overcome their differences and work together. Though some children are still lost today, Australia's government and its people are working on bringing them back together. I guess in the end, the children did come back.
The children came back, the children came back. The children came back. Back where their hearts grow strong, back where they all belong, the children came back. Said the children came back. The children came back.